So some handsome fellows convinced you to buy the phenomenal new indie strategy RPG Dark Deity 2 with their well thought out and even more well spoken reviews of the game, and now just a few scant chapters later, a magical demon dog with 3 heads is melting the faces off all of your characters with witchfire. How the hell do you play this game, you might ask? Well, don't worry, fellow citizen. I am here to provide assistance with 16, count them, 16 combat tips for Dark Deity 2. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. Hello everyone, if you enjoy what I do, including guides to recently released strategy RPGs that may or may not try to knock your socks off, such as Dark Deity 2, then a like on this video and a subscription to the channel would be very much appreciated. In fact, we are perilously close to breaking 30,000 subscribers here on the channel, which is a huge breakpoint for visibility. So, if you enjoy my content, it would be incredibly kind if you could subscribe and help me break into this next tier. Thank you so much to anyone who does so, as well as everyone who has supported me, Jane, and the channel all these years. I never would have expected that we would be here at this point, so thank you. Do note as well, before we get into it, these tips are not guaranteed to be applicable on demonic difficulty. I am still working through my run of demonic. These tips are based on my run in deity. Demonic is a whole different beast and definitely requires a different approach, so try them if you want, but there's no guarantee here. Just big disclaimer on that one. So, that said, tip number 1. Ability usage is key in this game. And I know some of you are going to be rolling your eyes because, like, yes, obviously, Tom, this is a key part of the game. I can tell as soon as I start playing it. But I always like to start with a tip that many will think is a no-brainer, because you never know what the experience level of a new player is going to be when they click on a video like this. So it's good to start very basic. That said, abilities are absolutely huge. You maybe could get away with just moving characters into range of enemies and letting basic attacks handle things like the OG Fire Emblems of old that Dark Deity 2 is definitely visually based on. But there is a robust system of mana and abilities here for a reason. All of your healing spells are abilities, all of your movement tech, abilities, all of your major damage boosts and status effect applications, abilities, and the game is very much balanced around it. So, do not neglect what abilities a character brings to the table through their own personal skills and their class skills. And very importantly, make sure you're paying attention to what skills you get as you promote to different classes, so you can build out a sort of setup for a character that's really going to complement not only their playstyle, but the playstyle of your entire team. And really, don't hold back. Like, yeah, you need to make sure that you keep enough mana on hand for emergency situations when you need it, but at the same time, mana regenerates at a pretty decent rate, and there's other ways to give characters extra mana if needed. So, use those abilities. It is absolutely worthwhile. They're very, very strong. Speaking of which, tip number 2, abilities are a good source of XP, and they don't necessarily need to impact a unit if they're not a direct attack ability. So, what does this mean? Well, whenever you use an ability, you get a not negligible amount of XP, like a pretty decent amount of XP. Not as much as if you would, like, destroyed an enemy, but still, something worth considering. And a lot of abilities can just be used if you kind of have a bunch of mana and aren't going to need it and you have nothing better to do with your time. Just pop an ability. Like a character that has a healing ability, just use it on someone. They don't even need to have HP missing. You can just do it. You have an ability that changes your attack type from physical to magical or back again, use that. It just gets you some free XP. Maybe some movement tech, being able to push a character around, drop a flag that boosts your attack. All these different options are available to get you a little bits of extra XP as you go, and considering the fact that you need to get to certain level thresholds before you can promote into the much more powerful higher tier classes, you do want to get as much XP as you can as fast as you can. Think of it kind of like the leaving a character poisoned in Fire Emblem so you can keep healing them for like 2 HP a turn with a heal staff to get your cleric extra XP, but like everyone can do it, that type of thing. Number 3, pay attention to enemy range indicators. Some enemies won't move and some bosses will. Again, right off the cuff, you're going to be like, yeah, obviously pay attention to where your enemies can attack you. But what I mean by this is that it will be a little deceptive sometimes whether enemy units are or are not going to move towards you. Some basic enemies are set up to guard specific points and will not approach you, so you can safely approach them and get everyone into position without potentially getting jumped. On the flip side, especially if you're used to the older Fire Emblem games, many bosses will actually charge you to try and destroy you when you get close to their objectives that they're guarding. You can't rely on them just hanging out and waiting for you to set up to get a big alpha strike on them. Some of them will, but many won't, including major bosses that have scary modifiers that will do some major hurt to you. So make sure you're paying attention to whether an enemy is actually going to move the way that you think they're going to move. Number 4, abilities and effects that grant bonuses stack, and you must make use of this. So what I mean is certain abilities can be used to give you a bonus, right? Reflector Shield is one of my personal favorites. It puts a buff on you that makes it so that when you get hit by an enemy, you deal a % of the damage back to them, right? Very nice, very solid. It can be stacked. So long as the buff lasts, you can continue applying it to yourself to get more stacks of that buff to exponentially increase the amount of damage that you do when the enemy hits you to get that reflection damage. Same thing goes for like attack buffs, right? The Seeker Archer class has a buff that enchants their weapons that it does 7 extra damage per attack for a certain amount of attacks depending on what upgrades you have. You can use this multiple times to apply that buff multiple times for longer and more attacks. Different abilities like this all function the same way, and you can get some truly nasty stuff going on so long as you're willing to take the time and the turns and the mana to really lean into it. But if you do, you can devastate enemies or potentially make yourself incredibly hard to bring down. Definitely experiment with your abilities and see what ones function this way. Most of them will, and it makes for a very powerful character. Speaking of Repulsor Shield is insanely broken, because again, you can stack multiple levels of damage reflection with no limit on the number of attacks it can impact, which is just nuts. How this works is when you put Repulsor Shield on a character, again, they will reflect damage back at the enemy. But unlike other abilities that say like, oh, this ability only functions for X amount of attacks, this is just for as long as the buff is. You can literally get jumped by 20 enemies in a turn, and you will reflect damage onto all of them so long as you can, survive that many attacks. And considering the fact that you can stack multiple levels of Repulsor Shield on your character, that means that you can potentially have a character that will just obliterate whole waves of enemies with no recourse. Just so long as they're tanky enough and so long as they have the mana to keep up the Repulsor Shield stacks, you're just good to go. It's disgusting. If you're ever having a hard time figuring out what to do with a mage character, or you're having difficulty with being able to hold the line against enemy waves, consider picking up an Aegis and using Repulsor Shield, or using their Repulsor Shield on another tanky character. You can do that as well. Number 7, support skills don't use up your turn. Don't forget to position for attacks when using them. So what I mean by this is your green and your blue skills. 9 times out of 10, I don't think I've actually encountered one yet that does end your turn. You can use these abilities and then still take an attack action. You won't be able to take another ability action, but say you have a powerful melee unit that also has a heal, right? Valeria is a good example. You can run up, heal an ally that's next to her, and then attack an enemy that's next to her all in the same turn, which gives you a lot of opportunities for efficiency, shall we say, of turn economy and actions. It is always to your best interest, if you can plan for it, to be able to do both of these things at the same time, because you'll just get more damage out there, and considering every single unit in the game is meant to be able to attack and deal damage, you definitely want to make sure that you're taking advantage of that for all of your characters. Now, it's worth noting that red skills do not function this way, as they function like attacks. So you can't have Arthur run up and Lunar Reeve something and then also have him basic attack something. That is his attack for the turn. Done. Speaking of Lunar Reeve, direct damage abilities are king. You should prioritize using them and building around them whenever possible. All right, this one I really can't overstate, especially as you get later into the game and enemies get scarier and scarier, especially on higher difficulties. Having an attack that does good damage, that you will not get attacked back when using, is huge, potentially too huge. There are some bosses that you can absolutely trivialize if you have a good number of characters with mana and direct damage abilities to just swarm them before they can even take any actions against you. And this is something that the dev team is clearly aware of, as later in the game, many bosses and even some enemies, depending on difficulty, will actually have the amount of damage that direct damage abilities deal to them. These are hugely powerful. Being able to play with turn economy, being able to break out of the normal system of attack, counterattack, attack that these games are known for, and just hit something potentially really hard, potentially a large number of somethings, should obviously be extremely strong. And any class that allows you to do this with any sort of regularity and any upgrades you can give them to make them able to do it more often and for more damage, absolutely should be your number one priority, make no mistake. And speaking of that, because he's been mentioned kind of twice now, Arthur himself is a disgustingly powerful character. Literally any ability build suits him due to his infinitely stacking damage with Lunar Reeve. So, as we just discussed, Lunar Reeve, very, very powerful direct ability because it just does direct damage at range, and every time you use mana with Arthur, Lunar Reeve gets stronger. So any build that you do with him, so long as you're using his abilities, which you should be because A, they're really strong, and B, he's a mage, will make this ability stronger. This means that he is infinitely scalable into the late game. He never needs to actually be engaged in direct combat. You can have him sitting back, like me as a necromancer, just summoning zombies forever until you need him to walk up and absolutely annihilate something, like he's Louis Su in the trailer or intro cutscene for Final Fantasy XIV getting obliterated by Bahamut, right? Like, that is what Arthur will do to anything near the end of a map once you've gotten a bunch of stacks of Lunar Reeve going. It is gross. It is the epitome of why abilities are so good in this game. It's the epitome of why direct damage is so good in this game. Arthur is a monster. Now, moving on from specifically direct damage stuff, number 10, long-range abilities can pierce walls that attacks can't. This is something that's very interesting about Dark Deity 2. Very often you'll find that your long-range characters can't actually just magically attack through walls or over terrain like you can in the Fire Emblem games. Like, you know, especially in the GBA games, it's always funny when you're in a castle, right? And there's a dude in a corridor, like on the opposite side of a wall from you. There's no indication that there'd be any reason that you'd be able to hit them, but you can just have a mage or an archer shoot them through the wall just like because game design. And it's fun, but it's always a little weird once you start to think about it. Dark Deity 2 takes that into account, and your attacks typically cannot do this. However, your abilities typically can. Whether they be support abilities that maybe will weaken targets or put poison on them, or direct damage abilities that can just target things at range, you can very often get around terrain limitations by using these abilities to your advantage. So just check what ranged abilities that you have and see if you can maybe get a little bit of a cheeky hit in or a cheeky debuff when you can't normally reach an enemy. It can be pretty handy. Number 11. Damage is determined by your might and your weapon damage, whereas your damage type is determined by your class and the weapon it can use. I've seen some confusion about this in the comments for my videos and like in the chat during my live streams and things like that, so I just wanted to address it here. How this works: your character has a might stat. It doesn't matter if they are a mage, if they're a physical fighter, there's no physical attack versus magical attack, you just have might. Then your weapon has its own damage stat that it will apply to your might to give you your overall power. Your power is how much damage you deal. The enemy defensive stat that you are targeting is what is determined by whether you deal magical or physical damage, and that is determined exclusively by your class and the weapon that it can use. There are some modifications you can make to this. Some weapons can have runes applied to them that make it so that they deal the opposite damage type than they normally would. There's also certain abilities that can swap your attack type between magical and physical. And those are very powerful, obviously, because it gives you versatility. But if you're ever confused about how this actually works, just look at your character's might, look at their weapon damage, and then look at what damage type the weapon says that they're going to do. That is the whole calculation. That is all the information you need to know what type of damage you deal and how much damage you're going to deal. Very simple. Number 12, enemies that look similar may have very different stat spreads and abilities. Make sure you're always checking their damage types and defense preferences. This is one that I've absolutely had to learn the hard way as I've been playing through on Demonic. It's still obviously applicable on every difficulty, but the difference becomes a lot more stark on max difficulty. Take, for example, these two trees here. One is kind of brown, the other one is kind of gray. The brown one attacks with magic damage in melee. The gray one attacks with magic damage at range. This makes for a very different scenario when you're trying to approach them. Also, different enemies may also have very different defensive profiles. Some may be a regular bear that has really good physical defense and not as good magical defense. Some may be a magical bear that has really good magical defense and really poor physical defense. Always check these things. You will generally be able to see, if you're paying attention, that there are differences in the design of these different sprites. Some of them are more different than others, but always check to see what it is that you're coming up against so you know not only what the abilities of a particular enemy will be, but also what defenses they prefer so you can approach them with the proper character. Number 13, and this is to do with clearing status effects. Clear bleed and poison with guaranteed kills. You need to go through a certain number of combats to clear stacks of various status effects, and by killing weakened enemies with your own weakened characters, you can more safely clear these stacks. So basically what this means is you have different status effects, like say poison, that have a X amount of turns or X amount of actions that you need to take before you're able to clear all the stacks, right? So you clear one stack per combat. Obviously, when you're poisoned and all of your stats are low, this is a very dangerous thing to have to try and deal with, unless you can kind of baby a character for a few turns, set up easy kills for them with enemies that have been brought down to very low HP, and just get that free attack in, get the kill, get some XP, and most importantly, clear one of the poison stacks. Because even if a character is weakened in terms of their stats, generally speaking, you'll be able to find an enemy that you can weaken in turn that they can then finish off, right? Especially if you poison that enemy in turn, right? Haha, level the playing field. So just find easy kills like this for your characters to be able to take, and you'll be able to clear a lot of these status effects fairly safely without just throwing them into the thick of combat. Number 14, and this is just another one that is kind of a general support tip for combat and maps, but check everywhere for map objectives. They can be quite obscure and hard to find. I actually ran into this a couple of times myself when I was doing my initial run of the game for my review, and there are definitely maps, not because they're poorly designed or anything, but just objectives are out of the way, intentionally, kind of hidden. And if you're spending too much time focusing on the sort of center of the map and like what your objective is and where enemies are coming from, you could actually miss these objectives and find yourself in a bad spot when you're like, wait, I was supposed to destroy that idol. Where is it? Oh, it's down in the bottom right-hand corner of the map and I forgot to check there. So just save yourself a little bit of time, do an initial scan of the map before you deploy, and figure out where your objectives are so you can have a battle plan of where it is that you need to go. Number 15, game speed can be doubled by pressing A or X on controller or clicking the left mouse button. This is just a general kind of like speeding up combat thing, but some maps can be quite large with very vast numbers of enemies, especially NPCs, and it can take a little while sometimes to get through those enemy turns. So fortunately, the devs did think about this. We do have a speed up option. Again, if you are using an Xbox controller, it is A. If you are using a PlayStation controller, it is X, or cross as the proper term, I suppose. And if you're playing on M and K, then clicking the left mouse button will do the deed. Doubles the speed, keeps things moving, and it's just generally a good way to save yourself some time. And finally, number 16, wounds are bad, but not crippling. Usually. As our last one, I decided I'd save a pretty big one as I kind of evolved my opinion of wounds over the course of the game. I initially started off thinking they really were not a big deal at all, and then as I got later into the game, I realized that they can get worse and worse. So how do wounds work? Wounds are functionally a replacement for a permadeath system. There is no permadeath in Dark Deity 2. Instead, if you lose a character, they will take a wound for the next chapter or battle. What this could be is a lot of different things. They could lose a point of movement. They could spawn with bleed stacks that you then have to clear. They could lose the ability to crit. They could lose the ability to dodge. They would lose any mana that they start the map with, etc., etc. There's kind of a sliding scale of severity here with wounds. Generally, you don't have to worry about it too much. You're not going to be overly crippled unless you get like the majority of your team killed before you limp across the finish line of a map. But every once in a while, you can wind up running into something that will truly be devastating for a character. So don't stress too much over taking wounds. Sometimes you might just have to switch up your battle strat, but if you have a particular character that you lean on really hard and they take a wound that can be nasty, it could become a problem for you. So just keep an eye out, but don't really lose your head over it. You know what I'm saying? And that, my friends, is my first 16 tips for Dark Deity 2. This was initially going to be condensed down into just a 13 general tips video, but then I kept writing and I kept thinking of things and people kept asking me questions that kind of implied the need for a tip about it. And now I have a whole nother potentially 2 videos between character building tips and general unit tips, and oh my lord, there's a lot to talk about with this game. So I hope that you've enjoyed this one, and thank you for your patience while I decided to finally finish editing it down and get it out the door, because boy, it just kept bloating. Scope creep is real. Thank you, of course, to all of you who choose to subscribe and support the channel. Hopefully we can reach that big 30K here soon. And of course, as you can see all their names scrolling by on the right-hand side of the screen right now, thank you to all of my patrons and my YouTube members. I appreciate each and every one of you for all that you have done for me over the years, for helping to directly support myself and Jane, our cat Trixie, and making the channel more successful than it has ever been before. Especially in times when ad rev is low, you guys are the ones that actually make this thing able to continue to run. So your generosity is always very much appreciated. Thank you all so much. I will endeavor to keep making better and better content as a show of support, and thanks for you. With that said, I'm going to wrap this one up here. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. If you have any questions or any other issues that you'd like to see me do video content for, drop it in the comments of this video, and I will see what I can do. And until the next one, I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.